Just suppose that tomorrow morning you went out and picked up the morning newspaper and opened it up and saw the headline blazoned across the front page, "Ronald Reagan switches to the Democratic Party." Or, Pope John Paul II becomes a Protestant. Or, Mikhail Gorbachev defects to the USA. Of course, at first you would be shocked. But then once the shock wore off, you would want to know what could possibly be behind such a dramatic change. What remarkable cause could have resulted in such an unbelievable effect? Today, I want to set before you a headline which is nearly 2,000 years old, but please do not let the dust of 20 centuries take the sting and the shock out of it. Because this particular headline is every bit as astonishing as those fictitious headlines which I mentioned a moment ago. The difference is this particular headline is not fiction, it is fact. It is a headline which would have appeared one morning in the first century on the front page of the Jerusalem Gazette. The headline would have read, "Paul becomes a Christian." Now, believe me, that would have been front page news. Understand, please, that Paul was the most brilliant, the most promising, the most visible young Jew of his day. He was the prize-winning student of Jerusalem's premier professors. He was a fiery, dedicated, charismatic leader. He was particularly zealous in his persecution of the Christians. As a matter of fact, so zealous was he that he pursued the Christians from one city to another. So determined was he to stamp out this rebel faith. He ordered, supervised, and perhaps even participated in the stoning to death of countless numbers of men and women, and yes, we also know from the record, countless numbers of boys and girls who held fast to faith in Jesus Christ. Paul hated the Christians with a purple passion, and every Jew and every Christian knew it. So imagine the shock to pick up the morning paper one day and to see the banner headline blazing across the page, "Paul becomes a Christian." What remarkable cause could have produced such an unbelievable effect? Paul himself gives us the answer. He says it was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And here in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul spells out what happened. He lists a whole series of appearances which Jesus made after the resurrection. The appearance to the women, the appearances to the disciples, the appearances to several groups of people, one of which numbered 500. And then comes the clincher. Then Paul writes, and you can feel the power and the emotion as he writes it. Last of all, he says, he appeared also to me. That Paul could not doubt. That is what reversed his life. It was as he came into encounter with this Jesus whom he had known to be absolutely dead, but whom he now knew to be absolutely alive, as he sensed himself gripped by a living relationship with this living Christ, it was that moment which turned his whole life around. And it was that moment which influenced all subsequent human history. Because you see, from that point on, the whole direction of Paul's life changed. Instead of giving himself to destroying Christians, Paul spent the rest of his life proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Paul. The gospel of a living Christ for a dying world. We are agreed, are we not, that we live in a dying world? It seems to me that whatever standard of measurement we apply, that is the conclusion to which we must come. Look, for example, at our hospitals, crowded to the doors with the sick and the dying. And yet, you know, physicians tell us that as many as 4 out of every 10 people there are there because they have first died inside. They have died in spirit, and now their bodies are simply engaged in trying to catch up with their collapse. And there are so many others who never go to the hospital but try to lose themselves in drugs or in alcohol or some other substance. But the end of the journey is always the same. You see, the journey of life has only one destination, and the destination is always the same. It is called death. No matter how we try to fool ourselves into thinking otherwise, that is where life leads. Oh, there are some who try to fool themselves into thinking that the real meaning of life, that which gives us a sense of power in life, is the pursuit of this world's goods, the acquisition of things. It's a rare thing these days to find anyone who is working for the sheer joy of being creative or the sheer pleasure of fashioning something good for humanity. No, the focus nowadays is always, it seems, on money. That in spite of the fact that life just can't be bought. For it is true of money that not only can you not take it with you, but it cannot even keep you here. And furthermore, it cannot make you happy while you are here. Surely, if we didn't learn anything else from the sad, pathetic saga of Howard Hughes, we learned that. No, the answer is not in the pursuit of things, for the end of the journey is the same, dead end. Well, there are some who try to fool themselves into thinking that the answer is to be found in the pursuit of intellectual greatness, sharpening our minds, acquiring knowledge, honing our intellects. That's the answer to it all. Don't count on it. W. Somerset Maugham was one of the great minds, one of the great intellects of this century. And yet you know what he said when the shadow of death fell over his life? You know what he said? He said, "Life is wretched, and my life has been wretched." Or what about Ernest Hemingway, a man whose intellectual gifts were staggering, but how did he die? By his own hand with a rifle shot. So much for the world of the intellect. Yes, the pursuit of ideas is noble and it's necessary for our living, but it does not give us life. The end of the journey is always the same: death. Not only do we live in a dying world, but we are dying people living in a dying world. I know we don't like to talk about it. I know we don't like to think about it. We don't even like to mention the word. And so what do? Well, we say things like, "He passed on," or "She crossed over to the other side." We can't quite bring ourselves to say it flat out. We know that the best thing for us to do in life is to make a will, and yet so many of us refuse to do it. Why? Because it seems so morbid. We go to the bedside of a terminally ill patient in the hospital, and what do? We paste a smile on our faces and we say, "You look great. I'm sure you're going to be better soon." We just don't like to think about it. We don't like to talk about it. We don't even like to mention the word. But the fact of the matter is that the sword of Damocles hangs over the head of every single one of us, waiting to fall, and nothing we can say or not say is ever going to change that fact. And the fact of the matter is that every breath that we draw and every step that we take brings us that much closer to it. We are dying people, living in a dying world. We are agreed, are we not, that that is true? But also we are agreed, are we not, that Jesus Christ is a living Christ. Make no mistake about it. Jesus died. That's right. The destination for Jesus in this earthly life was the same destination you and I will experience. Jesus died. Paul says it right here, says it so simply, so plainly, so starkly that you cannot mistake it. He says, Christ died. He said the word. Christ died. He was dead. Dead as a doornail. But then Paul says something else. He says, but Christ was raised. You see, death is not the end of the story. Jesus Christ defeated death. Jesus Christ reversed it. Jesus Christ drew its sting. Jesus Christ will be shown two sights which are suggested to be the burial places for Jesus Christ. One site is called the Garden Tomb. It is located behind St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. It is a beautiful setting in a wide shaded garden where flowers grow and bloom in colorful profusion. It is a lovely spot indeed. The other site is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Archaeologists have agreed that that site is probably the most likely site for the burial of Jesus. But that site is, how shall I describe it? It is covered over with an immense marble structure with silver inlay, a great, ornate, gaudy, no, downright ugly monstrosity. And the whole place is covered with candles, some of them burning and some of them simply melted and burned out all over the place. And the stale smell of old incense is in the air. It is hardly what you would call a lovely place. In fact, it is dark and ugly. I have visited both places, and I have to tell you something. I found that I couldn't pray in either one of them. I couldn't pray in the lovely garden, and I couldn't pray in the ugly monstrosity. I couldn't pray in either place. And the reason I couldn't pray in either place is because the only reason the tomb is important in Christianity is because the tomb is not important. Jesus Christ left that place. The angel said it, he is not here, he is risen. The tomb is meaningless. The tomb has been cast aside. Jesus rendered that tomb powerless. He rendered it unimportant. He left that place. Jesus Christ is a living Christ. Back in the latter part of the last century, there was a great celebration surrounding the completion of America's first transcontinental railway. You remember the circumstances of how that railway was built? The track was laid simultaneously from the east and from the west. And at the point where at last the tracks met, thus completing the link between the east coast and the west coast, it was at a place called Promontory Point in Utah. At that point where the tracks met, a great golden spike was driven into the ground. And once that golden spike was driven in, a telegrapher's key touched off a one-word message to the world, and that one-word message set off a great celebration. The one-word message was this: done. D-O-N-E, done. I want to say to you that that is the message of Easter. Done. D-O-N-E, done. Let the celebration begin. Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead. Done. He is the living Christ. We are agreed, are we not, that that is true? But then we are agreed, are we not, that this living Christ can transform our dying into living. We are agreed on that, are we not? I mean, Jesus Christ not only defeated death for himself, he defeated death for all of those of us who follow after him. Understand, please, Easter is not simply some historic event way in the deep, dark past. Easter is here and now. The reality of resurrection is not something that happened once way long ago and we read about it on the pages of Scripture. Resurrection is a reality that happens right here, right now. How do I get hold of this? Let me try to do something that I would never normally do in a sermon. And as a matter of fact, I probably shouldn't do it in a sermon. But today, I think it's worth the risk. Because you see, there is a great truth hidden away here in 1 Corinthians 15 that is just itching to be released. And so I want to ask you to do something that you never expected to do on Easter Sunday. I'm going to ask you right now to hold on tight to your pew and let's become temporary students of the Greek language. Because you see, there's something here that I want you to see in such a way that you'll never forget it. Paul, in writing about the events which surrounded that first resurrection to eternal life, that first Easter, Paul describes the events one after another. And every verb in every sentence is a verb which is in the aorist tense. Now, in the Greek language, the aorist tense refers to action which took place in the past, something which is finished, something which is over and done with forever. Aorist tense. Paul writes, Christ died. It's an aorist, over and done with. Christ was buried. It's an aorist, over and done with. Christ was raised. It's an aorist, over and done with. Christ appeared, and then there's the whole series of appearances. Christ appeared, Christ appeared, Christ appeared, Christ appeared. All of them are aorists, all of them over and done with. But then when he comes to the heart of his argument, suddenly everything changes. He says, but now Christ has been raised to new life. It's no longer an aorist. The verb here is in the perfect tense. And in Greek, the perfect tense refers to that which is yesterday, today, and forever. The perfect tense refers to that which takes place in the past, yes, but also which takes place in the present and which will take place in the future. That's what he's saying. Christ has now been raised to life. Jesus Christ not only lived on that first Easter, Jesus Christ is alive here and now on this Easter. Jesus Christ is alive now and forevermore. You see, Paul understood that there is no theological proposition which will ever convince us that Jesus was raised from the dead. He understood that there is no clear proof which will ever be set before us which will convince us unalterably of the resurrection. He knew that. Paul knew that there is only one way for us to believe that Jesus Christ is alive. We have to meet him in our lives. We have to encounter him in our experience. We have to come to know him in our daily walk. That's the only way. And you know what's so incredible is that it's happening. It's happening all over the face of this earth. People are meeting him. Consider this, and here I'm speaking especially to our young people. Will you please listen to what's happening among those who are young like you. I'm speaking to young people especially. Listen, Stanford University, when a student is admitted, but before that student actually enrolls in the school, that student is required to fill out a very lengthy questionnaire. And one of the questions on that questionnaire is this: who or what is the greatest present influence in your life? Last September, more than 40% of the incoming students at Stanford University answered that question with 2 words: Jesus Christ. Now understand that you can't be short on brains and get into Stanford University. And understand also that the question asked the greatest present influence. He is, and those students at Stanford know it, he is alive. He is present. Right here. Right now. Or consider this. An incident which transpired in Czechoslovakia not so very long ago. It was reported by Michael Green. It seems that a communist lecturer from the Soviet Union was sent to Czechoslovakia to deliver an address to an enormous gathering of students and their families at one of Czechoslovakia's largest universities. Do you know what the subject of the address was? Denying the resurrection of Jesus. And the lecturer spoke for nearly an hour. When he had finished, out in that great audience, there happened to be an old Eastern Orthodox priest. And this old priest stood up right where he was seated out there in the crowd, and he asked the lecturer for permission to respond to the address. At first the lecturer was nonplussed, but then he regained his composure, and he said to this old priest, "All right, I'll give you 1 minute." He had lectured for nearly an hour, and he offered the old priest 1 minute. The old priest said, "I don't need 1 minute. I only need 5 seconds. And with that, this old priest turned and he faced that huge gathering of people. And suddenly, from the top of his voice, he cried, "Christos Anesti!" The 2 words with which the Orthodox Easter service begins. Christos Anesti! Christ is risen! And with that, the whole audience stood, and in one great roar of response they cried, "Orithos Anesti! He is risen indeed!" I tell you, my friends, in lands all across the face of this earth, in lands which are enslaved and in lands which are free, people, old and young, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, black and white and red and yellow and brown, people in every land and nation on this earth, people are meeting him. And when they meet him, they know that he is now and forever alive. And when they meet him, they know that because he lives, they shall live also. So many times I have been blessed to remember a man who met this living Christ. A man who found in this Christ not just the gift of new life, but also the gift of deliverance from his alcoholism. And a man who from that time on, every single Sunday morning, would stand in the passageway which led to the pulpit in his church. And every Sunday morning, as the minister would pass by on his way to the pulpit to preach, this man would reach out and he would tug the minister's sleeve and he would say, "Dominie, tell them that they can. Tell them that they can." You can. You can. You can meet this Jesus. He can live in you. You can live in him. You can meet this Jesus. I'm not talking about something that's 2,000 years ago. I'm talking about something that's right here, right now. You can meet him. And when you do, you discover that he gives life. No matter what you may encounter in life, no matter what you may encounter in death, Jesus Christ gives life. Claim him. You can claim him as your own. Claim victory. Claim life. Say it right now. Say it in your heart. Say it with the Apostle Paul. Jesus Christ shall reign in my life until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And the last enemy, oh yes, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Hallelujah. And amen.